Good afternoon, and welcome to this panel on gendered work and gendered labor. I'm Daena Goldsmith. I'm a professor of rhetoric and media studies at Lewis and Clark College. And I'm really pleased to see so many people here for this panel that will cover trucking and dyeing and food and a range of issues involved in work and labor related to those topics. Before we get started with our panel, I did want to mention that the final panel of the symposium will begin at 4 p.m. And because you need to pre-register to attend panels, if you are interested in that panel, you may want to take care of your pre-registration right now through the link that's available on the Gender Studies Symposium schedule. That panel is entitled No More Stolen Sisters, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And it's presented by members of the Bonneville Power Administration, American Indian Alaska Native Employee Council, and co-sponsored by our Lewis and Clark Native Student Union. So if you're interested in that panel and you have not yet pre-registered, please go ahead and do that now before the pre-registration closes. The format for our panel today will involve each panelist presenting for about 20 minutes. As audience members, your audio and video will be muted, and we will open up the chat for you to send questions that you may have to one of our two Gender Studies Symposium co-chairs. Either Kendall or Phoenix will be behind the scenes on the chat and monitoring those questions. When we get to question and answer after all of the panelists have presented, you'll also be able to raise your electronic Zoom hand if you would prefer to do that, and I can call on you. If you experience any technical difficulties during the session, you'll see that Henry is our host and he is available to help you problem solve. So you can send a chat message to Henry if you need any assistance. You may also notice Zoom auto captioning is available on my screen. I know that's the default. I'm not sure how that'll be set up on your screen. So if you want that to go away, you can do that. If you want that to show up, you can do that by going to the bottom of your screen and clicking on the closed captioning button that's available there. We are recording this session for archival purposes with the permission of the participants, and we ask that you don't record anything that's being presented there. And the question and answer will also be included in the recording. So if you prefer not to have your identity associated with your question, you can ask your question in the chat, and that will give you that anonymity. You all are probably familiar from this, from having spent, nearly a year now on Zoom. But I know that when I am in sessions like this as a presenter, it can be a little weird to talk about something you care very much about and to not have those physical cues that we're used to having face to face. So I encourage you as audience members to use your emoticons to snap and applaud and clap and let us know that you appreciate what the panelists are presenting to us. And I'll, as one of the few people whose screens will be visible, I'll be doing my part to do that as well. And then please do contribute your questions, contribute your comments, contribute your encouraging words in the chat or by raising your hand at the end to let them know just how much you appreciate and are engaged with their presentations. So with that invitation or opening, I'd like to introduce our first presenter. Doral Thompson is a Lewis and Clark student scheduled to graduate in 2021. And her presentation is entitled A Truck of Her Own, Women, Space, and Gender Tools in the Trucking Industry.
So like Daena said, my presentation is titled A Truck of Her Own, Women, Space, Gender Tools in the Trucking Industry. Before I start, I'd like to mention briefly that I mention a moment of harassment. So if you need to mute me, feel free to do so. So every day, truck drivers navigate the road, regardless of time of day, weather condition, or global pandemic, in order to bring us fruits, vegetables, medication, and toilet paper. But the job of a truck driver often goes unnoticed because common items are rarely off the shelves. So while we see them on the road nearly every time we get on an interstate, they remain semi-anonymous. So the pandemic left me thinking about who was bringing us these goods. And then I realized when I think of a truck driver, I visualize a white cisgender man. So this highlights stereotypes about the industry, but also emphasizes the anonymity that continues even further when we talk about women in the industry. So over 90% of truck drivers in the United States are cisgender men. Yet women, trans folks, non-binary people have played a role in the industry. Despite the fact that trucking is extremely male-dominated, my research on women in the trucking industry highlighted their love for the job that they have built their own success in. Through this presentation, I would like to explore the ways in which women in trucking use gender displays across the spectrum to successfully navigate gender tools and barriers that exist and construct the trucking industry. I will also discuss the importance of placemaking, or the intentional creation of safe spaces within their truck, which further works to break down gender roles in the workplace. So both of these elements are working hand in hand to create these women's success in the industry. So for my research methods, I conducted 6 interviews, either over Zoom or by phone, from September to November of 2020. These consisted of 3 interviews each with 2 local Pacific Northwest drivers who both identified as white, cisgender, heterosexual women. And I also conducted 1 interview with a woman driving in the South who identified as a Black, cisgender, heterosexual woman. To further support my arguments, I conducted a content analysis where I read through 5 public blogs for truck drivers on trucking. In doing this, I was looking for themes in these blog posts that came up in my interviews. So it's important to note that this study does not sufficiently reflect the experiences of LGBTQ+ and BIPOC folks within the industry. Here in the Pacific Northwest, these populations are underrepresented in the field, which only highlights systemic barriers that inhibit their ability to join. Despite this, my study does reflect patterns seen across individual interviews and individual blog posts, emphasizing the validity of my findings for a portion of the population. So I will be discussing gender under Judith Butler's theory of gender performance and gender performativity. So just to go over that briefly, under the concept of gender performance, gender is unstable and continuously taking shape through different social interactions and situations. So this theory is saying we are not confined to act in ways that the binary gender stereotypes tell us to. So I will be referring to this as undoing gender, because it gives actors the ability to deviate from those binary gender stereotypes. So gender performativity, on the other hand, is replicating normative notions of gender within the binary. So gender performativity aligns with common binary gender roles. I will be referring to this as doing gender. So for women in trucking, women are doing both. They are doing gender or performing in stereotypical feminine ways, and they are also undoing gender through using a variety of different gender strategies across the spectrum. Therefore, both of these concepts are being used in order to successfully navigate a male-dominated industry. With that being said, I will argue that neither gender performance nor gender performativity is reducibly negative, because in this case, they both work to facilitate the success and happiness these women have in their job. So one of the ways women create success is through the use of stereotypical displays of maleness. So in this case, emphasizing their toughness is a strategy to assert their authority as valid and skilled drivers while gaining respected access into the field. So this is done by using confidence and/or aggression in both their speech and body language. So when asked about harassment, Wanda, one of my participants, responded without hesitation and said, "You have to let them know you don't play. I don't play with the guys." Rainey, a blogger from truckingtruths.com, reflects on a moment when a man grabbed her by the arm, and she wrote down her response, which I'll read to you now. If you knew me, you would know it would be detrimental to your health to grab me. Since you don't, I'll give you a warning. Let go of my arm immediately, or you will find your hand under my tractor tire. So while these statements are very different, they both leave little room for misinterpretation. Wanda and Rainey are both enforcing their agency, making it instantly clear that they will not tolerate unwanted attention. So this confident expression of toughness shows their use of stereotypical masculine characteristics in order to take power and assert their own authority. Wanda and Rainey are undoing gender through performing in ways outside of feminine gender stereotypes. However, with that being said, they're also highlighting typical gender norms. Men inherently have power in this space because they're outnumbering other genders. So this is illustrating issues such as gender-based discrimination and harassment that are partially created due to a lack of diversity in the workplace. So, but despite this being true, Rainey and Wanda take the power away from potential perpetrators and empower themselves by declaring zero tolerance for unwanted attention. Therefore, their confident toughness goes against normative expectations for women. Thus, these actions are undoing gender. Audre Lorde states, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," meaning we can't break gender barriers or roles by working within these gender stereotypes that define what is masculine. While I can't agree more, these actions of toughness challenge normative displays of gender and confront power relationships in the workforce. So while these individual actors are not changing a systemic culture of hegemonic masculinity, they are chipping away at structures through the repeated use of gender strategies such as toughness. So another element that facilitates their success is expressed in the way they present themselves. All of my participants emphasized that they valued their personal display of femininity represented in their physical appearance. And so this was either through wearing makeup or doing their hair or having fake nails. And this was so important to them because it connected them back to their identity as a female when in a male-dominated space. I'd like to note that femininity can be expressed in many ways, but their physical appearance was the thing that made them feel feminine. So that is what I will be discussing. I also want to note the concept of feminine beauty is constructed through normative notions of gender displays that have patriarchal undertones. While this is true, these women made it very clear that there is power in choosing one's own representation, especially in spaces when those representations are uncommon. So when asking Sue if she felt as though she needed to be one of the guys, she responded to me, "Oh no, definitely don't want to. My water bottle is pink, I have earrings, I match my mask to what I'm wearing. That's why I keep my long hair, because I don't want to be like some of the girls with short hair and a baseball cap, because to me, I feel like a guy and I really needed my female." When asked the same question, Emma, another one of my participants, responded, "This is what I've always said. I've changed professions, but I'm still a woman. I got up every day, took a shower, put on my makeup, dressed decent, and when I went to school, I got up every day, put on my makeup, did my hair and everything when I was at every other job. And this is me at another job, but that's it. I do this for me because this is me." So both Sue and Emma emphasize the importance of displaying their femininity through their appearance. even though the trucking industry is male dominated, these spatial implications of masculinity do not change the way they choose to portray themselves, because it is important to their own personal identity. So while Sue and Emma are both doing gender based on normative notions of gender displays, I would like to claim that this isn't reducibly negative. My participants felt powerful through being able to be good truck drivers while identifying as women and expressing their femininity through their appearance, because those characteristics are important to their own personal identities. So this example only further emphasizes the complexities of gender. So like Butler's gender performance theory, we can't reduce these women or anyone, to that matter, to be simply feminine or masculine, because this reductionist approach is not taking into account the fluidity and unstable qualities of gender. These women instead are using gender strategies across the spectrum to create successful work environments for themselves. So another important concept that aids in their success is the creation of place in spaces that hold gender meanings. So this concept of space is pretty theoretical, but I would assume that it wasn't surprising to any of you that trucking is a male-dominated field. So with that in mind, when we think of a truck, we most likely associate it with maleness. I mean, trucks have been a symbol of masculinity since childhood. If we're thinking about this in a very binary, very stereotypical way, in a sandbox as a kid, girls were told to be playing with dolls and boys were told to be playing with trucks. Because of this deeply rooted ideology, a truck as a space has gendered implications and meanings that are defined by masculinity. So the people in those spaces also help to define those gendered implications in that space. So with that being said, we see how a space like trucking, or the truck, which is predominantly male dominated, contains gender relationships and hierarchies. So while it's very clear that trucking is a male-dominated space, I argue that women's entrance alone begins to shift the definition of the space itself. According to gender roles within masculine spaces, women are the wrong bodies in the wrong place. Therefore, their entrance begins to chip away at these deeply rooted gender implications of space. So with that in mind, many of my participants described to me how the truck itself actually became a space of their own, thus shifting the masculine definition of a truck through their own actions and choices. So when talking about her space in the truck, Sue said to me, "It is my space. If you think about it, that is my easy chair. That is my big window, whether it's the living room window or my big computer in front of me. I'm watching this screen all day long, you know. Some days it's a Western when I'm going through the hills and the trees and I see all the deer. Some days it's a city movie where I'm in the city watching pedestrians and parades and everything that goes on." So here Sue is comparing the driving seat to a recliner and the windshield as her window. And so we see how the truck has become a place that she compares to home. Emma, another one of my participants, said to me, "I'll spend a 500-mile trip and not have the radio on at all, and not be on the phone hardly at all, my entire trip. It's a perfect environment to just shut the world out, if you will, and enjoy the stillness of the night." So The truck for my participants become a bubble of independent choice that exists in a world with responsibilities. And in this case, if she so chooses, she can shut them off. So this focus on the created and intentional stillness is key for Emma and many others. But for both of these women, the enclosed space of the truck provides an area of personal autonomy for them to exist in ways that they so choose. In general, the trucking industry is a male-dominated space, but the privacy of an enclosed cab creates a rare environment for solitude and autonomy. Because of this, women have room to make the cab of their truck their own through the things they listen to and the things they bring with them. These choices impact the environment and work to neutralize the generalized masculine space of a truck. The truck then becomes a place of their own and thus suppresses the masculine gendered pressures of the space. In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf states that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. In this case, the truck is working as a room of her own because it is her space away from the gendered pressures that exist throughout the world of trucking and ultimately aids in her being successful in her field. So because of this, we see how the entrance of these women into male-dominated spaces have begun to change the masculine definition of trucking. But this is not to say that women are changing the gendered nature of this job as a whole. But their presence challenges the norms and affects and alters the space they are in. So, despite the fact that trucking is a male-dominated industry and women have been historically and systemically the wrong bodies in the wrong places, these women have developed ways to be successful in their career. And this is both through doing and undoing gender and creating an environment of their own within these trucks. Both of these elements begin to chip away at the gender definition of this space and thus create room for them to feel successful and happy within their career. Thank you.
Thank you, Doral. There'll be an opportunity to ask Doral questions after we've heard all of our presenters. Our next presenter is Shelby Rockelein, a Lewis and Clark alum, and she will be presenting on The Price of Dying, How Capitalism Stole Women's Role in the Good Death.
Cool. So thank you all for being here. I really, really appreciate it. I was supposed to give a presentation last year for the Gender Studies Symposium about a similar topic, and I ended up being scheduled for the Friday that the world shut down. So I didn't actually get to do it, which was a huge bummer for me. I was really excited for the opportunity, but now I'm here, which is really nice as well. Just a warning for everybody that I have my little dog here and they're constructing my upstairs right now. So there might be a little bit of noise and I really apologize for that. I also wanted to say that I think that my love of zest and flair for the dramatic kind of got in my way this time with my title. So I altered it a little bit to make it more accurate to what I actually want to be talking about, which is The Price of Dying, How Capitalism Radically Altered Women's Role in the Good Death. So before we really get into it, I just want to do a content warning really quick. I know that we are all still living in a pandemic. There are 530,000 less people here today than there were at this point last year. We've all been dealing with death a lot. So if at any point you hit a wall, you kind of just can't participate anymore, no worries, you can either mute me or step away. Do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves. I also have some drawings of illness. So illness and sickness also come up a lot, just so everybody's aware. Alrighty, so what are we talking about here? What is the good death? The good death is a very subjective concept. There are 7 billion answers to this question. So what are we talking about here? When I say good death in the context of this conversation, I mean an intimate, realized, and involved death. So I'm talking about the ability to interact with death, both for the person who is dying and the people who are there to facilitate that, specifically women. So the ability to be fully present for a death is what we mean when we're talking about the good death within the context of this particular presentation. And to make it a little easier to understand, there's kind of two factions here chronologically when we're talking about death. So there is before 1850 and after 1850. This isn't like a hard, fast rule. It's not like 1850 was the year that everything switched, but it is a pretty good timeline for when things started to make a transition into a very different idea and concept of what dying looks like in the United States, and specifically our relationship to it. Important to understand that that's about the time when we start to lose touch with death and we're no longer able to be present with it in almost any capacity. So dying before 1850, what did it look like? So where are people dying? People are dying usually at home, and they're dying mostly of viral diseases. Think tuberculosis, smallpox, influenza, things like this. Deaths that are happening very quickly. Usually somebody would die within a few days to weeks after the onset of symptoms. And this is happening at a point in time where medicine is not very advanced. There are almost no doctors. Hospitals exist, but they're almost always in cities. They're private institutions. They're not necessarily accessible to the majority of Americans who are living in small rural communities. So healthcare comes primarily from women who are using their intergenerational knowledge to care for the sick and the dying. It's a very physically and emotionally demanding position to be in. Dying or caring for somebody who's dying is a very particular kind of skill. It's a very physical skill. You're dealing with a lot of fluids, noises, things. People are losing complete control of their bodies at this point, especially with viral diseases. There can be a lot of pain involved. It's a very complex process, especially when it's somebody that you have grown up with or you raised or were raised by. They're very intimate connections already. And then women at this point in time are getting very physically involved with the dying process, which generates a very specific kind of attachment to the idea of dying and death in general. It's much more intimate. I've always said that imagine that your life is like a room with a door, and you can kind of let things in and out as you please. Some things stay in the room, some things stay out. Today, we like to think of death as being outside of the room entirely, and things that you can let in, but then once you're done with it, you let it back out. And at this point, that wasn't really an option, right? Because people are dying at home, and then they're also after they've died, they're being taken care of at home as well. There's funeral homes, again, not necessarily accessible to everybody in rural America at the time. So the dead are being cared for by the same women who helped them die, who guided them in that process, who took care of them in their final days. This is another extremely vulnerable position to be in. When you're dying, you're in a very vulnerable position. You require all of your care to come from the people around you. And when you're dead, you especially require all of your care to come from the people around you. So bodies would have been washed and dressed by the same people who helped them die. It kind of acts as this final act of care they can provide in the physical world, at least, for these people that you love and that you care for. It's a very, again, physically and emotionally demanding position because you have that intimate connection with somebody, because you have that history, but also because they cannot help you in that process. So washing and dressing people who have passed away, it requires a lot of physicality, which again is developing a very strong relationship to the concept of dying, as well as the fact that you're reaffirming your relationship to this person by being able to perform this very intimate act of care. So bodies would have been washed and dressed. They would have been displayed in the house, in the parlor of the house is what you see a lot of people saying, but I'm not super sure that that would have been something that a lot of people had. So if it wasn't the parlor, it would have been your bed that you lived in every day, that you died in. That's where they display your body for people to come view you. And then the body would have been buried within 24 to 48 hours of dying, because this is before embalming. So bodies do what bodies do, and they start to decay very quickly. So what we're seeing in both the dying and the dead process at this point in time is that there's no walls between women and the idea of death. they are at the front line of dying, as both the act of it and then the care of people after they've died, and then the act of decaying, things that we're not necessarily associated with today, that we're not very familiar with. So there's no walls, and women as homemakers, as caretakers, and as facilitators of common culture, being, the head of at least the household as far as maintaining the inner home structure, are able to permeate this idea that death is literally around the corner all the time, which I know today can seem very morbid, a really weird way to look at the world of constantly being aware of your own mortality. But at this point, not having the choice actually creates what I would see as a very positive environment, because you know that death is going to be there. It's always in the room with you. You don't have the choice to lock it out. So it's a very, very different relationship to death than we have today, particularly where women are involved. Okay, so 1850, not a flip switch, but a turning point. What starts to change around this period? A lot of things start to change very quickly. And of course, with this, hard date, 1850, there's a lot of fluidity. There's a very mobile timeline. It's not that 1850 was the year that everything changed, but it's when it started. So what does dying after 1850 look like? It looks drastically different than it did in the era that we were just talking about. So people are dying now mostly in hospitals. Hospitals, public hospitals that we would start to recognize, start to take shape between 1870 and 1930. So they start out as public institutions, mostly meant to care for the sick and the homeless. And they're run mostly on a voluntary basis. Because medicine is so rudimentary at this point, it doesn't require as much education as it does today to be a doctor. And doctors mostly volunteered their times at this hospital. Nursing wasn't even necessarily an established practice at this point. So the women doing that work were also volunteering their time. But as we hit industrialization and urbanization, not only are people getting more access to hospitals, but we're starting to eliminate those diseases that were killing people en masse, like tuberculosis, smallpox. We develop inoculation, so people aren't actually dying of these viral diseases that kill people very quickly. They're dying of chronic illnesses, which are much more complex and harder to treat. So doctors need a lot more education, which means they need to get paid a lot more. Nursing becomes a practice, which means they need to be paid. And hospitals become something that are both very expensive to run, but can be very lucrative. This is where we start to see capitalism step in and start to alter our relationship to death writ large. So doctors and nurses become paid. They're dealing with chronic illnesses, which are also not things that you can treat at home very easily. These are diseases that require very complex care. They need to be conducted under professional medical supervision. They need to be conducted in hospitals. You can't just go home and die at home. In fact, 85% of people about today die in hospitals, which is not where 85% of people today want to be dying. About 80% of people, if you ask them that question, want to die at home. But because of the illnesses that we're dying from, because of these advances, that's not always possible. And that also means that the role of women has changed dramatically. So nurses, who are usually women, obviously still play a huge role in the physical care of somebody who is sick and somebody who is dying. But they are mostly in charge of the physical part of that, right? So not necessarily the emotional attachment. They might not have that same years and years and lifetime of connection with somebody that you would if you were taking care of a loved one. They have to kind of put up that barrier, because dealing with that much death every day, especially in a culture that's not entirely comfortable with it, would be so detrimental to their physical and emotional health. So there's a little bit of a barrier there when you're talking about nurses. Whereas families are taking over the emotional side of the support. So you can be emotionally present and to a degree physically present for family members who are dying of one of these chronic illnesses, but you don't necessarily get that same physicality if somebody's in a hospital and somebody else is taking care of all of their physical needs. You don't necessarily get that hands-on approach, which really adds this extra element of care to somebody who's dying. So and you can see here this picture, it looks very different than dying in your own bed. It's a very sterile environment. It's not necessarily familiar to you. And while your family can be there, it just looks very, very different than the comfort of being in your own home. Caring for the dead after 1850 also looks dramatically different. And this is where we really start to see capitalism kind of take over and create this whole new beast out of something that wasn't previously there. So we see instead of the dead being cared for in funeral homes by their families, or I'm sorry, in the home by families, they're taken over by funeral homes. Undertakers become morticians, and this is mostly due to the introduction of embalming as a common practice. Embalming was introduced to the United States really in the Civil War, obviously not a new practice, but within the context of the United States, started during the Civil War as a way of transporting Northern soldiers back home so that they could be buried and cared for by their families. And then after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, he was taken on this kind of cross-country tour. His body was a final farewell for people. And seeing him embalmed, perfectly, preserved, starts to popularize that practice. And now it is incredibly common to embalm people, which is removing one layer of us having to deal with the idea that people decompose, and they decompose relatively quickly. They don't look like they do when they were alive. We kind of funeral homes and morticians are very good at adding as many layers between us as they can of the fact that somebody has died. They try to familiarize this, so they make them look as close as they can to sleeping, which is not always, not ever, what people look like when they're actually dead. And it starts to become, again, a very lucrative industry because we're not able to have that physical care there, because we're not able to wash and dress our loved ones ourselves. We have to replace that level of care with something else. And what the funeral industry has done is create a perfect situation for you to be able to supplement money for that act of care. So we start to think that because we can no longer perform these final acts of love for our loved ones after they passed away, that the answer is to just pump as much money as we can into their funerals. We start to think that the better casket is the best way to honor their life, when in reality, that might not necessarily be the solution. But we don't feel like we have a lot of options because this has become a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. We've definitely been trained to believe that this is our only option. Traditional funerals with traditional burials, embalming, and cremation, that this is all we have. So women have effectively been taken out of this entirely because the majority of funeral homes are not run by women, they're run by men. Most morticians are men. And while we're starting to see a change in that trend, for the most part, that has been the standard because morticians and funeral directors started as undertakers, which was the male role before 1850. It was the people who dug the ditches, who built the coffins, are now becoming the heads of death in America and changing entirely our relationship to it. So a quick recap, pre-1850, death care was woman and family centered. It was a very personal, very active role. And you were able to develop a very personal, familiar relationship to death because it was in the room with you all the time. You were forced to deal with it every day, or if not every day, at least enough that it didn't feel like something that happens once in a while. It was definitely something that you were always aware of, as opposed to after 1850, where death care is mostly handled by professionals, where the care by familiar women in the family, friends, loved ones, can be emotionally intimate, but they're physically removed from the process, which creates a very distant relationship to death, which affects everything in the way that we conduct ourselves. Capitalism is very focused on being productive, on your ability to produce. And you can't produce if you're dead, and you can't produce if you're grieving. So it has done its best to try to push this narrative that death is, that grief is temporary, that death is so far away, that you're going to live forever, so that we're able to keep, because if we all lived like we were going to die tomorrow, the whole system would collapse. That's just kind of just what it is. So all of this is not to say that it's like a totally done deal, that women have no role in death. Absolutely not. I've already mentioned nurses and that trend that's changing in funeral homes, but I wanted to end my presentation by kind of highlighting some women who are doing some really phenomenal work within the death industry today to try to change the trends of how we view death and how we understand dying. So first is Caitlin Doty. She is a mortician in LA. She's the founder of the Order of the Good Death, which is an organization dedicated to trying to change our perception of death in the United States. If you have any interest in death at all, I would highly recommend looking into this organization. The work they're doing is phenomenal, and they have a lot of members who are just doing incredible things within the death care industry. Her focus as a mortician is really, really interesting because she focuses mostly on green funerals and making these green funerals and green burials as accessible to the family members as possible. She's all about open access and allowing family members to participate as much as they can or as much as they want to within the legal binds and within emotional binds so that they're able to have that full holistic experience of the death of a loved one, which can help the grieving process and help understanding what that means to them in the future. Next up, we have Alua Arthur, who is a death doula. If you know what a doula is, a traditional doula help people who are giving birth from pregnancy to birth and then some aftercare in the immediate months following. A death doula does the same thing, but for people who are dying. So the work that she's doing is helping people prepare for their deaths, helping them actually through the process of dying, and then helping the families for a few weeks to months out, depending on the situation with how they're grieving. She actually taught my death doula course that I took last year. The work that she's doing is absolutely phenomenal, is revolutionizing the way that we understand death today and the way that we're all processing death today. Next up is Monica Torres, who is a deserologist, which is to say this, it's the study of mortuary makeup. So her background is as a professional makeup artist, as a beautician. So she started her work as a mortician with all of this extra knowledge of how she works mostly with cases of severe decomposition, of severe trauma cases, of trying to present bodies in a way that are manageable to family members so that they get to say their final goodbyes. And as a mortician, as one of the leading morticians in the field, she's definitely trailblazing for women who want to step into the more traditional funerary work. And then last up is Katrina Spade, who is the founder and CEO of Recompose. So women have really found their niche in green burials, which is a really hot button topic right now because traditional burials and cremation are actually very bad for the environment. So Recompose is a new facility that they just founded in Washington. It's the first of its kind. Washington is the first state in the country to legalize this process. And it's essentially composting people. It's what they do. It's incredibly good for the environment. It's a really good option for people who aren't comfortable either being buried, if they want another option, trying to make that more accessible to people. So just showing that, again, that women are kind of on the forefront of revolutionizing this industry and kind of taking it out of what it has been, which has been pretty rigid for the last few decades. And that's it. So my final takeaway is that women's role in the good death is still here. We just have to work a little harder to find it. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Shelby. Our final presenter is coming to us from the University of Puget Sound. Michelle Kofman is presenting on food for gendered thought, an examination of the patriarchal division in the domestic and professional realms of cooking.
Hey everyone, sorry. Thank you so much for having me today. I could not be more thrilled, and the last two presentations were so thought-provoking. I am so grateful to be here. So I did change my title a little bit. This is based off of my GQS thesis. It's one of my majors at the University of Puget Sound. And the updated title is An Examination of Gender Division, the Patriarchy and Interlocking Systems of Power in the Domestic and the Professional Realms of Cooking, because I really wanted to focus on how all these different systems have created cooking as an institution, both domestically and professionally. So this is a menu, if you will, of today's discussion. There is a brief content warning. I may mention sexual assault or domestic abuse very briefly, and also the current literature is very binary in its language of gender, which, as I hope we all know, gender is not a binary, and so keep in mind that while I'm talking, there are many other ways to think about gender rather than just male and female. So I just want you all to take a moment to reflect of what comes to mind when you think of domestic cooking in your home. Maybe think of your mom or your family. What kind of people, celebrities do you think of? And then versus professional cooking, what are your favorite restaurants? Who do you see in the kitchen? Who's the boss? What's that environment like? And this really got me started on why I wanted to. So this is my own Instagram. I show a lot of Instagrams throughout the presentation. So I thought I would show my own, and it really made me think what I am portraying and the messages I'm sending, and I wanted to really decenter my body. I have one photo here that was Thanksgiving, and it really made me think, why am I posting this? What is the image that I think women feel pressure to post when they're cooking? And I don't personally want to become a professional chef, but I'm sitting right in the middle. So this is kind of where my interest stemmed, and then I wanted to examine it through a GQS lens. So my argument overall is that cooking is an institution. It's a structure in both sides, in both spheres of domestic and professional cooking. And it has been shaped by systems of colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and it has harmful hierarchies of white dominance, wealth, and binary gender, where men hold power over women and other genders, and encourages compulsory heterosexuality. So my guiding theorists, I will talk about them briefly because I think it's important of what lens I'm exploring this topic through. So Judith Butler in her work Gender Trouble problematizes the idea of sex, gender, and sexuality as natural categories, and rather argues that they are all social constructions created through performative acts and gestures. So gender really is an act, it's a performance, it's something that you do, not something that you are. So Butler's claim of society she claims that society has scripts that create what is acceptable gender performance, and that this creates intelligible categories of male versus female, and that's in which our personal validation is created within. So Kimberly Crenshaw, the theory of intersectionality, conceptualizes the experience of people who are simultaneously affected by numerous identity categories such as race, class, gender, religion, so forth, and looks at their experiences with all their identities in mind and how that creates a unique experience, a unique struggle. And if you're not looking at all these different intersections of identity, then you're trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. Michel Foucault. Foucault's theory of panopticism describes a disciplinary mechanism in which society organizes human multiplicities. An ideal state of panopticism requires an omnipresent surveillance society, so everyone watching you all the time, and it requires a self-regulation of tenants. So really, when we're monitoring ourselves, that is the ideal state of panopticism. And lastly, Alan Johnson, he is about defining, well, he's not about this, but he describes the patriarchy as a system defining men and women as opposites, and that there's this naturalness of male aggression, competition, dominance, and a naturalness of female caring, cooperation, subordination. And really, the patriarchy values males and devalues females and femininity. So a brief review of the current literature on this topic. These were 3 guiding reviews that I went over in my thesis, but lots of other people are doing really important work. Koch describes how women are primarily responsible for kitchen duties, and also looks at other influences such as social class and race, and that factors such as a stable work schedule, access to a kitchen, access to ingredients, so forth, affect how people perform their gender in the kitchen. And that in food service, we often see in lower end restaurants, which I'll get into later, we have people of color and women, whereas in the top, hot cuisine, you're getting the men. And in Mills, she also talks about race and also talks about how women have this subversive power to, which I don't know, I had a little bit of a problem with this, but talking about how mothers could make their kids' foods healthier. If you think about hiding the broccoli under the cheese, it was this kind of secretive power that they had over their family through cooking. And then Swenson looks at how Food Network as a channel is a strategic site to examine gender, class, culinary arts, labor division, consumption, and finds that women chefs are tied to domesticity, legacy, caring for their family or for others, whereas men enter the field as scientists, chefs, athletes, and entertainers in order to protect their masculinity in a female-dominated field in the domestic, not in the professional. So my methodology was to review with a theoretical and intersectional lens facts of domestic and professional cooking, and then 3 different case studies that I will go over today. So here's a little graph that I really like. It's a breakdown of domestic meal prep in labor by gender. And what I take from this is that women are doing the majority of both meal prep and grocery shopping, but men conceptualize that they are doing more than they actually are. So I think that's pretty crucial. And also race intersects with gender in producing hierarchies in domestic spheres where people of color, specifically women, are often doing domestic duties, including cooking in the homes of white people, as from a historical lens and today. So in the professional realm, less than 7% of head chefs and restaurant owners are women, even though half of the people graduating culinary school are women. So when did this discrepancy happen? And according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2012, the average yearly wage for male chefs was just below $33,000, and for women it was $27,000. So over a $5,000 discrepancy, which is very big in annual salary. So yes, it is easier for a woman to become a CEO than a head chef, not by that much, but still by a significant amount. So also, as I previously stated from Concha's work, Black, Latino, and people of color are disproportionately put in back of the house positions and in low-end restaurants like fast food. So these are my 3 case studies. We'll start with Gordon Ramsay, who is 53-year-old British male. He has been ranked #1 chef in the world almost every year. So he's consistently conceptualized as the top chef in the world. He is the 19th highest earning celebrity globally, like as a whole, like, you know, counting Beyonce, whatever. So Ramsay really is a white, Western, cisgendered male and is going to these other countries. You can see on his website, the first describer is internationally renowned. So why is that the first describer? And I argue that Ramsay is benefiting economically from this idea of colonialism and neocolonialism going to these other places, and like, it really feels like the white man going to like foreign third world countries and teaching them how to cook and settling his restaurants in, and then benefiting economically from people eating there and taking the space of other possibly local restaurants. And he has his television show Uncharted, which he travels to different countries. And I mean, just the word uncharted implies that these places don't exist until him, as a powerful, wealthy white man, goes and explores, quite reminiscent of Christopher Columbus. So yeah, colonialism is super present in him and his image. You can see on his Instagram, a screenshot of his Instagram. He also talks about his family a lot and his wife. She's like a supermodel. So compulsory heterosexuality and how he uses this trope to benefit economically of being this, like, here in the picture of him with his bike, being athletic, and he's making all these TikToks about like just videos of these people cooking and just destroying their techniques. And, you know, from all of his shows like Kitchen Nightmares, Hell's Kitchen, Hotel Hell, it's really this theme of aggression and dominance. And that's what the idea of a male chef in the professional realm has become, and what they have to do to be successful. So that's kind of sad to me. But So fourth, Rae Drummond. She's known as the pioneer woman. So she's 51 years old and she has a net worth of 50 million. She also has a Food Network television show. She does a lot of advertisements, cookbooks. She has kitchen and homeware product lines. She also has the largest social media following compared to other female counterparts. So for comparison, Kat Cora, who's a professional chef that's been on Chopped, I think that's the show, a lot, and only has 337,000 followers on Instagram. Rachel Ray has 1 million followers. Martha Stewart has 3.5, and Rae Drummond's, I think, followers just increased to 3.6 actually. So compared to Martha Stewart, they're very comparable. And I think that would be the other largest idea of a professional female chef, even though she clearly is a professional chef. I mean, she has all these amazing things. She has kitchen books and restaurants and TV shows, but she advertises herself as a domestic cook. So why does she do that? And I argue that she's doing that because it's profitable, right? If you fill the role that people want you to be, you're going to profit from that. And that's what capitalism has been created through all these other systems. And it's a lot of white cooking, like, I don't know how to describe it, but it's not very flavorful. There's not a ton of spices. She cooks a lot for her family. She calls herself the pioneer woman because she moved from LA to Oklahoma to start up this family with this cowboy. But what conveniently is not told in her story is that her husband that she met in LA has a net worth of $200 million, and his family is currently the 23rd largest landowners in the United States with over 433,000 acres of land. So the pioneer she's advertising herself as, pulled herself up from the bootstraps. American exceptionalism, came from nothing and created this net worth with her family, right? But it's a little bit easier when you marry into $200 million. So yeah, American exceptionalism, patriarchy, being a homemaker, heterosexuality with her cowboy husband. That's her first identifier in her bio: wife of cowboy, mother of four, lover of food, writer of books. Why is it that her role as a wife and a mother is more important than every other identifier? And she's not, I'm sure she is a lover of food, but the way that she's marketing herself, not as, professional chef or TV network chef, she's just a lover of food. It's very light and feminine and homemaker-like. So Samine Nostrat is my third and final case study examination. She's my personal favorite professional chef, and I think she's a beacon of hope for a lot of people. She's currently 40 years old. She's first generation with Iranian parents, and she has a net worth of $1 million. Excuse me. She has on her Instagram 591,000 followers. So not too shabby, but compared to the others, we see this stark decrease in her net worth and in her following. So she majored in English at UC Berkeley and then became a cook in a restaurant and then traveled to Italy to learn how to cook some more. And she now has a book, a podcast, and a show, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. You might have seen it on Netflix. And she's also one of the 5 food columnists for New York City. And what I really admire about her is the way that she decenters her sexuality and her gender in her cooking, as you can see with versus Rae Drummond, how that is really her driving force and why she cooks. Samine is able in this way to step away from it while she continually, acknowledges her identity, and she uses her platform to lift up voices of people and organizations such as, voting advocacy, Indigenous rights, Black Lives Matter. You can see she highlights other people of color who are doing really important work both in cooking and outside of cooking. And when she travels on her show, it's with this deep appreciation and learning, not of teaching and colonization. So it's quite a big shift of what we see from the last 2 case studies. So in conclusion, Ramsay and Drummond exemplify this valuing of whiteness and American exceptionalism, whereas Samine demonstrates a different experience of how pervasive race is in life growing up and becoming a professional chef in her own experience. And what she had to overcome to really find her place, which she does talk about in her show a little bit, and then also just reading about her personal history and interviews. And then in terms of patriarchy and compulsory heterosexuality, there's this expectation that chefs live up to their roles, and that their relative popularity affirms these patriarchal expectations in conformity to gender stereotypes, right? Gordon Ramsay and Reed Drummond are the most successful, and they're the most adhered to their expectant roles. So wealth as well kind of enforces all of this. You can see that from these systems of racism, patriarchy, and heterosexuality, they converge to make the most successful chef, Gordon Ramsay, who's the white male straight, and he's the most successful. And then second, Drummond, where she affirms on the controversy all the female roles, and she does also get considerable financial success from that. And then Nostrat, while she is doing really well, I think she should be doing exponentially better, but it's because that she's not financially benefiting from sticking to these expectations. So in conclusion, cooking is an institution. It's a system, both domestically and professionally, and has been shaped by converging systems of neocolonialism, race, and patriarchy to perpetuate these harmful hierarchies of white dominance, wealth, and binary gender. And we can see that through examining the facts of the division and labor of homes, the role and pay gaps in professional spheres based on gender and in race, and as well through the 3 case studies. So why does it matter? Johnson says that, as the saying goes, what evil requires is simply that ordinary people do nothing. And I think that's really important in conceptualizing what our role is in changing this institution. It's really thinking about it and challenging how we perceive chefs on TV or on our Instagram or in cookbooks, and really amplifying the voices or choosing to read new things by people that are challenging these narratives, and to ourselves challenge them. I'm usually cook in my pajamas and with my hair up in a bun, but then I'll get changed and post a picture, in my outfit that I would eat dinner with. Why do I do that? And I've stopped doing that because I think it's misleading, and I'm doing that, I think, because of female pressures to fit into this mold. So these are just a few of the works that I cited in this presentation. So I encourage you all to go forth and challenge these narratives and cook good food and read good books. And I really appreciate you all being here.
Thank you to all of our presenters. You can give them a Zoom hand, a Zoom thumbs up, a Zoom heart, a Zoom celebration, whatever emoticon to show our appreciation. If you have questions for our presenters, you can post them in the chat where Phoenix and Kendall, our co-host moderators, will be able to pick them up. You can also raise your hand electronically, since we're enough of us, yay, to be on 2 screens. I may or may not be able to see you on my display, but if you raise your hand, we'll notice that in the participants and call on you. While you're continuing to mull over and think about your questions, maybe I'll jump in a little. I was really fascinated by, obviously there was the through line of work and labor that we anticipated in your presentations, but I also felt like there was this through line about this tension between doing and undoing gender. And I had some questions for you for each of you about that. Dorrell, I was really interested in maybe the relationship between the enactments of toughness and confidence, and then the choices about and preferences about physical appearance that was more consistent with traditional femininity. And I wonder if the doing and the undoing that you were picking up on is more of a constructive dialectic, that those kinds of clashes get us to thinking about and questioning gender, or are those more of a double bind? That because you're tough and confident, you have to kind of compensate then by having a physical appearance that's more conventional. Did you get a sense from your participants about whether this was a constructive dialectic or more of a bind that they were trying to manage and balance and compromise?
Right, right. And that is definitely something that comes up in literature a lot. There is this concept of, if you are in a masculine sphere and you're losing something stereotypically feminine through being in this masculine sphere, you're going to pick up on other feminine qualities and really heighten them. I think for these women, that wasn't really the case. They felt so, they were genuinely really passionate about their work and passionate about how good at their work they were. But at the same time, they were very clearly proud to be a woman and to have the appearances of their version of a female. And so I think there was this combination of being prideful that both of those things could happen.
Thank you. It looks like Ken Rockelein has a question. Ken, do you want to unmute, or Henry, I guess you can unmute Ken for us and ask us your question.
Yeah, thank you. My question is for Ms. Rockelein, and I was wondering if she thinks that our current situation that we're going through in the world, really, with the much more frequent rate of dying and the increased isolation of people dying, might trigger some type of a social backlash towards a more die at home type of thing, similar to how we had the birth at home become more popular. So will dying at home become a more popular option for people in the future, does she think?
I think that it might. I think that's something that we're seeing a lot out of the pandemic specifically, is people being very distraught that suddenly people are dying alone in hospital rooms with, obviously, again, with nurses and doctors present, but you don't have that same connection to your nurses and doctors that you do with your family members. I think that the statistic that I shared about 85% of people dying in hospitals tends to be pretty shocking to people. I don't know if it's like super known that that's how many people actually are not able to die at home. Especially even the fact that a lot of people, like, the idealized death is I would like to die at home surrounded by my loved ones. And the idea that that's simply not accessible to so many people right now. I think that I've definitely noticed that being one of the most traumatic elements of the pandemic. And I mean, I've given, this is totally my bias coming through, but I'm hoping that in reflection upon that, people are going to be a little bit more willing to try to push to have that option available at home, so that people aren't going to different facilities so that they can pass away, and they're actually able to do it in, humane is not the word, but maybe a more realized way, a way that's a little more personal to them. Because I think that we tend to think of death, because we've created such a separation, as something that's separate from us, and like we should isolate it. And I'm hoping that this extreme isolation is going to push us to just take a step back from that and realize that that's not necessarily the best way to go, especially since just the concept of it is so horrifying to people that I'm hoping it'll force that correction.
Yeah, maybe not humane is the right word, but maybe a more human way.
Yeah, exactly. Human. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
We do have a question in the chat. It's for Doral specifically, and it says, how do you think this work compares to men entering female-dominated work? For example, can men be empowered by entering a female-dominated occupation? Do you think it has more of an effect on the gendered structure of the workplace? What are similarities and differences between what it's like to be a woman in a male-dominated industry and a man in a woman-dominated industry?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know how much of that I can answer, simply because I really didn't look into that. But I guess if I was just speaking off the top of my head, since men inherently have, a structural power in the patriarchal system that we live in, I think their experiences are different. despite these women being really successful and really loving their job, which was this really wonderful surprise, they had to work really hard to do that. They had to prove themselves. They had to, you know, really show the fact that they were killer drivers. And like I said, I don't know anything on this, but I would assume that men and women dominated fields don't need to prove themselves in the same way as women in male dominated fields. So that's what I would say to that.
We have another question in the chat, and this one is for Michelle. It says, what do you think is the answer to get focus on female chefs and change the perception of how they are viewed? And do you have any thoughts about the recent Burger King ad that focused on women in the kitchen?
Yeah, what a great question. I think why I chose Samine Nostrat is because I think she offers this example of how we can challenge these narratives, and it's really getting people in the field that aren't the norm and getting them visible and having that visibility, that representation, and that I think empowers other people, right? We have narratives because that's what we follow. And when you offer an alternative narrative, other people can follow that. So I think representation is so important. And my issue with other female chefs like Kat Cora is that she has, in many ways, adapted to the masculine mold of a professional chef, and that's kind of how women had to make it for a long time. Those 7% of people that made it into the top really adopted hypermasculinity, and because they had to, right? But now I think pushing back on that in both sides, so men saying, I cook to care for my family because, you know, my wife's working a job and not doing either like, you know, diners drive and then dive, it's all greasy and hyper masculine or whatever, or not Gordon Ramsay, who's this, you know, high cuisine, offering other examples for men and offering other examples for women and offering other examples for non-binary people, right? We just aren't seeing that. And so Samine was like, you know, one of the only, I mean, there are not to say there aren't, there are some really amazing. There was one chef I read about, a transgender chef, and they were doing amazing work leading a kitchen. So these are starting to come out, but it's definitely slow. And I honestly haven't seen the Burger King ad. I'm going to search it up as soon as this ends. I think I saw, I think it was on International Women's Day, right? I think that was like, it was something about that. And I mean, it sounds great. I don't know, there's some capitalistic motives that give me some anxiety behind that. But again, if it's all about offering alternative narratives and representation, you know, women in the kitchen and men in the professional kitchen and men in the domestic kitchen, I think are good opportunities for growth.
Do we have any other questions for our panelists?
Another one just came through in the chat. It says, thank you for all your thought-provoking presentations. I have a question for Michelle. I was just wondering if you came across any cases of female chefs that were rewarded for adopting patriarchal masculine behaviors in the same way that, quote, girl bosses sometimes do for adopting masculine coded values such as dominance, lean in, aggression, etc.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the chefs that just comes to mind, and I don't know if she's offering alternative narratives too, but Kat Cora really offers this hyper masculinity and like just in her stance. And I mean, I'm not, you know, devaluing her for doing that because, you know, maybe that is what she wants to do, but I definitely think that there's this pressure from women. And if you watch any kind of professional, you know, Chopped or World's Table, I think is a Netflix show, a competition, any professional cooking competition, most of the women you're going to see there are adopting these hyper masculine behaviors and attitudes because I think it's like a survival mechanism because nothing else is accepted. And if they want to get into that room, that's how they have to do it. And I've worked in restaurants and the women who were in, you know, the one woman who was in the back was the meanest there. Like she was the biggest bully, right? Which I think speaks to this need to conform in order to make it in the room, which is a big problem. And I don't think we should be encouraging toxic behaviors that are associated with masculinity most often. So I think that answers the question, just to expand a little bit. But that's why I think we need to start talking about it, because there's not many conversations, and this really matters too, because everyone eats, right? So.
Shelby, I'm fascinated in your examples by how the women who are reclaiming a role in death and dying are doing it as professionals. And I wonder if you have thoughts about whether, what are the pros and cons of that? That on the one hand, it's maybe women reclaiming this role and then allowing families and people who are dying to experience maybe something closer to their vision of death, but it is still buying into that idea that it's a professional service that you pay for, rather than having it go back to being an act of personal care in families.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely thought about this a lot. I thought about it when I was even including them at the end of my presentation, because I wanted to highlight that originally I said like stole the women's role in the good death, which is objectively not true. It just changed it. But I think the best way to answer this question is to refer back to when I was doing the death doula training. And this was something that came up a lot because Alua Arthur is paid for her services. Her job is to be a death doula. And the conversation came up, a lot of people not being comfortable at all with accepting payment for doing that. And I personally was kind of in the same boat. It made me really distraught that if I was to be a death doula, that's something that people would have to pay me for, when that seems like something that should just be a human right. But at the same time, these are women who are dedicating their lives to changing the structure, to fixing the system, and they need to survive too. They need to eat, they need to put food on the table. So it's definitely a very hard balance to strike of, you can't be here and step out of capitalism. You can't do this work and survive it and actually be able to demonstrate what you're doing without buying into it a little bit. So it's definitely a really tricky balance to strike. In an ideal world, I don't know, maybe somebody else would pay them so family-released individuals don't have to. It's something that comes up a lot though, because everybody dies. Everybody deserves dignity in death, but apparently you can't really do that right now without money. So I don't know what the solution is, but it is it's something that comes up all the time when you're talking about this.
And there's that domestic professional dichotomy that Michelle talked about too, that what women do is domestic and we do it out of care. What men do is professional and it's valuable enough that we pay for it. So how do you break out of that? Phoenix, do you have questions in the chat? I'm noticing one other question in the chat. Oh, Phoenix had to Zoom problems for Phoenix. I see a question in the chat for Shelby about the kinds of support a death doula would provide today, and just a little bit more about how that role has evolved.
Yeah. So death doulas are super rad. What they do is super dependent on who they are. They're pretty new. They've only been around maybe a decade. The concept of one. Obviously, death doulas, as in practice, have been around for centuries. It's just what people do. But since we've lost touch with that, it's kind of come back in a common fold as a profession. So it can look like a lot of things. It can look like that you have a terminal illness and you want to start preparing while you still have the faculties to do so that your family doesn't have to do the work after you've already died. So they can focus on grieving you and not on, getting all of your stuff in order, which is a very, very complex process. There's a lot that goes into preparing to die that I don't think people even realize, like a lot of things that I didn't realize, like who's going to get your Facebook account? Stuff like that. It's like the very nitty gritty of dying. And what they're doing is they're trained to literally walk you through every step of the process. If not just the big stuff of like working through your will, but an advanced care directive, who decides if you're on life support to take you off. It can look, that's a big one. It can look the same thing for people who aren't terminal, who just want to be prepared in case something happens, of getting everything in order, not just a will, but the entire process. It can look like actually being there while somebody is dying, while they're in their final days. Of literally being the process of helping families facilitate a death, of massaging somebody's legs as they're dying, because your life leaves from your limbs first, and helping them through that process of setting up a deathbed, like literally what smells do you want, what sounds do you want, like the actual nitty gritty, and then helping plan a burial, green burial, providing all the alternatives that we don't necessarily know about, because people think of burial and cremation as the main ones, but it turns out there's a bunch of options, and be able to present people with all the options. So it's a very dynamic position to be in. It can, you know, not everybody's requirements are the same. And then it can look like supporting the family after, even though grief isn't necessarily the main focus. You definitely as a doula develop that connection with the family, and being able to support them is part of what you would do. So it looks like a lot of different things for a lot of people, but those are kind of the, you know, the main huge sweeping brush that I'm painting them with of what they would do.
Thank you. Kendall has a question for us in the chat.
So this is for all three of you. How has your research into these modes of labor/work informed how you think about the labor/work that you're interested in doing yourself, or has it?
I can start. I think working in a restaurant in high school as a hostess, I was like, there's absolutely no way I'm going to become a professional chef. Like, this is horrible. And seeing the examples on television, it was like, well, I can either become like a professional domestic chef, or I can become like this hyper masculine dominant chef. And that's not the way that I like to lead or interact with people. So it was kind of like, also, I didn't know how to cook until 2 years ago. It's a very recent hobby, but as I started to cook and started to love it, you know, I was like, you know, I feel uncomfortable in both realms. I feel uncomfortable in the domestic and I feel uncomfortable in the professional, because I don't like the examples of either, because it's so gendered, it's so hierarchical, it's so binary, right? There was no positive place. And so doing this work and finding examples, specifically Samine, opened up that there is a possibility. You have to work exponentially harder to, you know, create a brand new narrative, which, you know, some people have now started. So you're working with some other molds, but, you know, I'm starting to maybe possibly think more about going into, you know, maybe journalism about cooking instead of professional like culinary school, but definitely around it and taking, you know, what we learn and what we do in gender queer studies and challenging our narratives into my professional career, whatever that may look like. So what a good question. I'd love to hear from the other two presenters as well.
Yeah, I can speak to that, I think. I think for me, something that was really inspiring about these women is just the power that our gender has. You know, gender is this fluid concept, and we aren't constrained by, you know, roles that are defining certain industries. We can still be really successful in industries that the world tells us we shouldn't be in. And part of that is because the power we have as humans. And I think that is so cool. So I think, yeah, great question.
So, I mean, my research on this topic has definitely defined the way I live my life in a lot of ways. I looked into being a death doula. I did the course, realized it wasn't necessarily for me right now. I've thought about working for a funeral home. I've thought about, you know, doing a lot of things in the death industry. That turns out kind of similar to Michelle. There's just a lot going on in like the professional traditional funeral industry that I'm not super down with, that I don't really want to participate in. Like, I applied to be an assistant in a funeral home, and the number one requirement is to be a good salesperson, which just set me off in a way I wasn't expecting. But I think I definitely would love to, as I, you know, go out into the world and grow and expand, participate in death in some capacity. I think funerals really interest me. I think that grief counseling has really interested me. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely like, this is the way that I live my life, is just thinking and hoping for opportunities like this to be able to like just talk to people about death and, you know, be able to bounce ideas off of each other. So.
We have a comment in the chat expressing appreciation to all of the panelists and grateful to have learned about the death doula role. The comment says, it sounds beautiful. Do we have other questions? You can chat them to Kendall. You can chat them to me. You can raise your hand. Let's give our panelists another electronic hand for their wonderful presentations. And thanks to all of you who attended. It's nice to have such a large group interested in these topics and supporting these topics, especially on a sunny Friday afternoon. We'll give you an extra little bit of time to get out and enjoy that. I'll remind you that in addition to that 4 o'clock panel that I mentioned, we do also have a theater performance tonight of The Secretaries. And so there are still some slots available to watch that live streamed. And if you go to the Gender Studies schedule, you can sign up for your live stream ticket and join us for The Secretaries this evening. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful Friday afternoon.